Yes, hello and welcome back to the DCAF podcast. I'm your host, Nigel Tommy, and as always, I'm joined here by Charles and Fuzzy. Hello.
Hello, everyone.
But, as these previous episodes have been going on, we have been getting guests, quite a lot of them, and this episode is no different, as we have Sir James Valentine from the DCR, or the Duck Civilization Railways. I say, it's quite an honour to finally be here on this podcast. I've heard it's been making the rounds. You could say that, yes. Now, the railways are quite important for ore and stuff. I'd argue they're very important in general, Nigel. We use them to transport all sorts of goods and people from place to place. But yes, they're also very important during war times for supplies, but they can also be used for other things. Yes, I remember there were some armoured trains going around during the Desert War. Yes, there was a lot of fighting between the railway of the Duck Civilization and Duckmany during the war. But to be honest, I'm not too fond of that, so we could perhaps talk about just railways in general, since I'm a bit more knowledgeable about that. Yes. What exactly do you do for the railways? Well, I'm the chairman, which means I'm the one in charge of operations and many things, really. It's quite a busy job, and I'm a very busy man, so I'm surprised I found it in my schedule to come by. Well, I see. Charles, your brother worked for my railway, doesn't he? Yes, he does. He's a controller for the southern branch, I think. What's at the western? I don't know. Yes, he works. He does a fine job, from what I know. Well, that's good to hear. My wife also works for the railways. She's an engine driver. Oh, really? I didn't know that. No, neither did I. Well, that train's not going anywhere. Nigel, are you making a women can't drive joke? Maybe I am, maybe I am not. Who is to say? Well, I have you know she's an excellent engine driver.
Well, yes, we all know that Charles isn't the best driver, so maybe it's reversed in his family.
Yes, that must be it. So, Sir James Valentine, why don't you tell us a bit of the history about the railways? How that whole thing start, huh? I see. Well, if I remember correctly, it all started with Richard George, who made the first locomotive somewhere in the 1940s, I think. At least that's when the railway became nationalised and owned by the country. So the railway company isn't independent. It's just, part of the government like the army. Yes, exactly. Of course, the railways were a lot different back then. It was mostly 12-unit gauge. What? 12-unit gauge, Nigel. It's our broad gauge, the broadest, biggest rails we have in our country. Oh, I see. I think.
I don't think Nigel knows that much about railways.
I see. Well, we started off with that wide gauge because early steam engines were quite big, and Richard George has experimented quite a lot with making one. After the railway was formed and basic traffic was on the way, a factory was built in Doncaster. This would later be known as the Doncaster Locomotive Works, or as we know it now, the Doncaster Wagon Works, as they don't exactly make locomotives anymore. They were shit? Well, as the kids would say, they quite fell off. I see. So they were shit. Well, not exactly. They started off as some of the smartest minds in our country, making wonderful locomotives like the E1, the Express 1, a locomotive meant for all types of express trains on the old broad gauge lines of the Foxlands. Wonderful locomotives, splendid things. Only 5 of them were built. I think 3 of them are still... Yes, 3 of them are still in service, and the 4th one is also still around, although it's not exactly in a working condition.
So most of them stuck around because they were so good.
Exactly, although other engines would come along, like the Marklins, as they called them, and the Class 08s, which now mostly run the trains. Before the E1s, we had also a bunch of coffee pot engines, which would handle smaller trains. And of course, how could I forget the Bowtie engine, which was made to pull a special train when Bowtie Duck's great-grandfather, who was also a Bowtie Duck, leader of the Duck States, came to visit. That's why we introduced the Duck States to railways, and later a newer company called Swindon Locomotive Works, who now make all of the locomotives. They would be commissioned to build the locomotives and rolling stock for the Duck States right after they were created, so they weren't the greatest, but they worked, and the Duck States was very pleased with them. Eventually they would also make their own locomotive works in Detroit with the Detroit Locomotive Company. So you've got like 3 big makers of trains. Yes, basically. And back in the old days, the golden age of our railways, they were quite feisty, each trying to outsmart the other and make the best locomotive in the world. And who won? No one really. I mean, Doncaster obviously lost. There's no arguing about that, as, they became a wagon works. As for Swindon Works, they're still around and make a lot of locomotives. And Detroit is also still around, but I've heard that the relations between the two is quite good, which is very good to hear. So they work together on certain projects, I assume. Indeed they do. But yes, shortly after, in the end 40s, start of 50s, we would start using what would become the standard gauge, and that is 7 unit, which is, of course, what most railway lines in the Duck civilization are now. So I'm assuming we also gave railways to Duckmany, which was a huge mistake. Well, not really. It allowed for easy travel between the two countries and trade or stuff like that. Good for the economy. But yes, it also allowed them to move military things inside of the country and stuff. Could you? I was trying to record that fucking. We're close to a training facility. It's bound to make some noise. Surprised it hasn't disrupted any other episodes. But, continue. But yes, it did allow for Duckmany to move tanks and other such things inside of the country and stuff.
What's the travel situation like now?
It's alright. We both have trains going to each other's country, even the capital in some cases, but those services have not been performing the greatest because of the raising tensions between the two countries. Of course, in wartime, we would cancel all trains leading to the other country, and transport and trade between the two would be completely blocked off. I see. Why don't we block them off now? Well, they do tend to give us gifts every now and again. We wouldn't get the Bop or our Panthers or a lot of things if we were to block off our railways. Fair point. So, are the railways prepared for war? Well, I may not be the greatest person to ask that. I'm not exactly sure. We have someone who keeps an eye on that, but I'd say so. We've got a good system. We're not in a locomotive crisis like we were in 2019.
Wait, locomotive crisis?
Yeah, I remember that was fucking stupid. You couldn't get around the bloody country. Yes, a lot of services were cancelled because we were getting rid of a bunch of older rolling stock and locomotives, which in hindsight maybe wasn't the greatest idea. And also, a lot of new traffic came. Business was booming, but it was too booming for us to keep up. If I remember correctly, you pushed into service some older locomotives from museums to keep certain lines running. Indeed we did. We asked the National Railway Museum if Duck civilization, if we could perhaps get some of our old locomotives back. The E1s were back in service, and some older stock as well. If it could be useful in any way on our railway, we wanted it. But now they're all back in the museum. So, in a time of crisis, a lot of those locomotives are still operational. Exactly, so who knows, during the war we might need to stoke up some antiques to keep everything rolling, in case we get into another power crisis. I see, well, the railway's involvement will definitely be interesting. Yes. We've also been developing locomotives specifically for the war. These are relatively easy to build and kind of all-round locomotives, really. Swindon's in charge of them. Although Detroit is also working alongside them for the smaller shunter locomotive. Ah, I see. We'll have 2 locomotives. One will be a smaller one for lighter trains and shunting purposes, and the other one will be a bigger one. Well, 2 classes of locomotives. If we had 2 locomotives for war, it wouldn't be much now, would it? No, that I don't think that would do so well. Precisely. How far are they both being done? Well, we've got the design for the big one done, and they're currently being built. So the frame is done for the big locomotive, and the smaller shunter is fully complete. However, it's got some technical bugs we still have to iron out. I'll see. Right, if I remember correctly, you mentioned like a power crisis. Don't you have like stupidly powerful locomotives? No, my good chap, I think you might be thinking about Duck Mini instead. Most of their mainline locomotives are quite powerful and big. Well, the freight ones, the passenger ones are often smaller, but still powerful and streamlined. And then, of course, you've got the vast network of narrow gauge tracks that Duck Mini has. I like the narrow gauge a lot. We also have some narrow gauge, correct? Yes, mostly on the Isle of Duck. They have a pretty much the entire island is covered in little lines, and we also have a decently big narrow gauge line running from Swindon to Seeds, if I remember correctly. It links up with the tram network at Seeds, which is also the same gauge as what that narrow gauge track is, which is 5 unit. 5 unit really isn't that narrow of a gauge. Well, yes, but it's narrower than our main gauge, so what else are we supposed to call it? I guess so. If I remember correctly, the Isle of Duck has 3 units? Yes, like Duck Mini has as well. Absolutely tiny things. Quite adorable, really. Yes, I think I've seen pictures. Yes, they're cute.
Yes, I agree. I think that might be some of my favourite locomotives.
Yes, people like the narrow gauge a lot. But I personally like more of the bigger express engines. Didn't you have like a specific gauge meant for war use? Yes. This was 9 unit gauge, slightly smaller than the original 10 unit gauge. Did I say 12 earlier? I must have misspoke. 12 is absolutely massive. 12 is if you count the rails with it, but if you're talking the gauge, the space between the rails is the 10 unit. But yes, 9 unit was what we were going to use. It wasn't great, to be honest. We made a handful of locomotives for it. I think only like 4 of them. And some basic vans to transport goods. The line runs from, I think, Pondon? Maybe not even there, maybe from Seeds. To be honest, we don't really use it that much. But we do. If I remember correctly, it forms a connection between some of the testing bases and stuff for the DCAF. Yes, I thought those trains looked bigger. Makes it easier to load tanks upon them as well. Yes. The main railways can also transport your vehicles. I assure you, we've got big enough rolling stock to do so, but it is indeed quite easier to do with a bigger gauge, which is also why those rails were made that way. I see. Interesting. But I believe I know what you were talking about earlier, Nigel. The more powerful locomotives, correct? Yes, because I remember seeing some poster for something. Yes, a heavy locomotive competition. I know what you're talking about. This was a competition to see who would get a certain contract for transporting heavy goods. These heavy goods were also army related, and it marked another locomotive being built by Doncaster in who knows how long. It's been a while since they've done that, but they were back and ready for the action, ready for the fight. It was the last locomotive made by the original chief designer, who was also around during the end of Doncaster Locomotive Works. Very old man, very nice chap still. And he did in fact design the most powerful locomotive that eventually ended up winning. Really, what was it? It was stupid. It was built for pure power and nothing else. It's not really that useful. But it's in the hands of the army now, so not our problem. Wait, so the army owns locomotives? Yes, I thought you knew that, Nigel. After all, you're an army man. You're quite high up in the ranks. Well, I'm not exactly in charge of the transport corps, but I guess that does make sense. You own a N58, which has been modified with a bunker on the tender and an anti-air turret. Yes. You're basically in charge of all broad gauge operations, at least the 9-unit gauge. Alright. And you also own that massive fucking locomotive. It's bloody large and bloody stupid. So I'm happy we got the second place one still working for the railways. That being Little Lily. She's quite big and quite powerful. So what about Detroit? What did they have? Well, my good chap, they didn't actually complete the locomotive in time, so they just sent in one of their normal freight locomotives. Now, the freight locomotives that Detroit builds are top notch. It's their cup of tea. They know how to build a powerful locomotive, but I'm afraid they got perhaps a little too ambitious this time, and so didn't meet the deadline. So they used one of their standard freight locomotives instead, which, although yes, very powerful and held up quite alright in the competition, it didn't quite stand a chance against the more powerful locomotives that were specifically built for the competition by the other firms. I see. Well, congratulations to the to Doncaster Works. I guess they're back into the fight of locomotives and making power and stuff. Not really. They, besides that thing, they haven't really made anything else. But the new chief designer, he's quite young. He's quite squiffy. I think he knows how to do something. He has a plan to try and get, it back in the ring. And how does that plan go? I don't know. He's not quite confident in his plan. He just really wants to have a go at making an engine. Who are your chief designers? Well, let's see. Well, since we brought him up first, we have Thomas F. Bullied. Unfortunate name. Yes, he's quite a young chap, but I see potential in him. Well, alright, so what about the guys who make the big, strong freight engines, what are they called again? Detroit Locomotive Company? Yes. The chief designer for that is Otto Baldwin. He's quite good, yes. Although they've also made a handful of more experimental types of locomotive, but I feel every manufacturer does that every now and again. Yes. I mean, the same can be argued for any manufacturer of anything. We've made some pretty experimental crap. Most of it sucked.
Yes, we also have done plenty of experiments.
However, I'm afraid we can't say much about that, as it's highly secret. Indeed. So let's move on to the next topic, that being the Swindon Works. Well, hold on, I haven't really gotten anything to say about Mr. Baldwin. Besides, he's quite good, but he is very, well, he's not a man of nonsense. He He's quite straight to the point. It always feels like he's in a hurry for some reason or the other. Strange, I know. But yes, Swindon Works is, well, they are quite good, and they have a lot of very talented designers. But the chief designer is Sir Stanier Dean. Sir Stanier Dean. Interesting name. Yes, he is a very, very nice chap. He's a jolly old fellow, and he really knows how to make a good locomotive. Made some of the very best ones on this earth, I'd say. Sure, some of his earlier works weren't the greatest, such as the P1. However, they did beat out the competition of the PE1 from Duckcaster. Horrid things. Absolutely horrid things. They did not work at all. They were supposed to pull massive express passenger trains. Yes, they could barely move an inch on their own power. But yes, he's made some very good things. He's made the wonderful, compact, tiny, and very useful S4 shunter locomotive. Used almost universally everywhere. A very solid one indeed. He's also made one of his earlier things, which was actually very good, was the privately owned locomotive from the works. They used the shunt mostly and pull their own trains. Is Rudolph, also nicknamed the fake mogul, as it looks like it's a 260, but in reality it's actually a 440. Fast little thing. I see.
Do you have any favourite locomotives?
No, I love them all dearly. They're all wonderful machines, and they all do very good jobs. I mean, I can easily tell you which ones I hate and which ones I suck, but to pick a favourite, it's quite hard to do. We have Thunder, a wonderful, strong, narrow-gauge engine. We have Tim, an absolute classic, one of our oldest locomotives. Also runs on the same narrow-gauge network. We've got, of course, the classic that is the E1, who used to do traffic for the Foxlands basically all on its own. Every train you saw being pulled, you can bet there was an E1 at the front. The N58s, which, despite being built in the middle of the locomotive crisis, were quite good. Smart, using old Duckman locomotive parts we found during the Desert War, and then sort of Frankensteining them together to make that thing. And there's also the F1, one of the actually decent locomotives from Redstone Works. But what about you chaps? If you know a locomotive, what is your favourite? Well, I don't know. I don't know much about the railways, as I said, so I don't know what locomotives there really are. I see. Well, whatever thing is peak Duck Civilization Engineering is his favourite. I have to agree the S4s are quite nice. Yes, exactly. Great for use for industries, branch lines, massive yards, station pilots. It's a tiny little tank engine with lots of possibilities. Indeed, they're these small, powerful little boxes dotted around our rail network.
As I mentioned earlier, I quite like the narrow gauge. I think my favourite, would have to be Pip.
Oh yeah, that tiny little brown saddle tank.
Yes, I think it's just adorable.
Yes, that is a very cute locomotive. I'm honestly not surprised you chose that. Well, would you look at that time? I think it's about time we actually wrap this up. So, thank you so much for being here, Sir James Valentine. And, you, of course, for watching. I'm talking to you, the viewer or listener. This is a podcast, who knows what you're doing. You could be sleeping, you could be making homework, you could be, what other things do people do? Draw? Yes. Yeah, any of those things. As always, you can let us know any requests, questions, so on and so forth. If you've watched the previous episode of this podcast, you know how it works. For any requests, for any things you want us to mention or talk about in a future episode, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay up to date with the DCAF podcast. That being said, as always, do we have any final words, chaps? Well, no, not really. Although we could have actually talked a bit more maybe about the other country's railways. I mean, what is that really to say? Dock Mini has massive articulates, high-speed express streamliners, and a lot of narrow gauge, some locomotives of which we also used on the Isle of Duck. But the Penelope Empire basically doesn't use its all rail network that it has from the Duck states, as it's got more high-tech ways of moving things around. And Snowchester, well, how do I explain their railways? Well, they have tractors on rails. Yes.